Well, let me go back and start before Avon, and let me take you back to a 16-year-old, 15-year-old who left school, dropped out of high school, because I wanted to do comic books. That was really what it was. I started as an inker, and I went to work for Cinema Comics, and after about 6 months of inking, mainly a strip called The Fighting Yank. Forgive me for going through all of this. You can edit it out, but it's the only way I can get a stream of consciousness going. So I was doing The Fighting Yank. We were in Manhattan on West 45th Street, and a couple of one-shots. Now, this is during World War II, and I think that's important to remember, because a lot of the themes were based on the war effort. And so there were always Nazi villains and our heroes and so forth. And, of course, most of the men from 18 to 40 were in the service, which made it easier for me to get work. It wasn't just my good looks, it was the fact no one was competing with me. In October 1945, and I mention that date because it astonishes me that I can remember it, but I do for this reason. Probably the most popular pulp magazine, I think, that I knew of, and there were about 150 every month, was The Shadow, which was published by Street and Smith. And I walked around with my work hawking, because I wanted to go freelance so I could study painting and drawing at art school. So I was working in the morning and evenings, freelance, and then I was at art school in the afternoon. I went over to Street and Smith, and they somehow gave me a job to do the lead story in The Shadow. The reason the story is so astonishing to me, this was October 1945. I was already in the Army when it came out. I had been drafted, but I had done it 3 months earlier. I met a man named Walter Gibson somewhere in the 70s. He was being honored at an actors club because of his contributions creating The Shadow. He was the writer who had written 50,000 words or more, and it was made into movies, made into a radio program with Orson Welles. And I said to him, Mr. Gibson, my name is Ray Kinstler, and I did a strip about 30 years ago, one of the pulp magazines. He turned to me and said, "You drew the White Skulls in October 1945. I couldn't believe it. He had a recall on all the artists, on all the stories he had written. He was an old man by then, well in his 80s. You did the White Skulls. So I had done the White Skulls. Then I was drafted, and I had one thing going for me. I was in the Army. I was stationed at Fort Dix. World War II, Europe theater had ended, and we were still fighting Japan. And I was moved from an infantry unit to Fort Dix, New Jersey, within half an hour of New York, and I was moved to a finance unit. This is interesting for a kid who dropped out of high school. They put me in charge of finance. Well, some of the early servicemen were coming out. They were being rotated and discharged. And so they would take troops from wherever they could. The reason I mention it is this. I was going into New York on a weekly basis, and the editors of the magazines, the pulps, and the comics were giving me work, so that I was being published for the almost 2 years I was in service. I'd pick up a job when I'd go in on Thursday, work at it at camp, go in the next week, get another job. I was being published. So by the time I came out, I had a continuity. This was very important because when I came out, I was able to step back right in because I'd never left. And so I went, I remember a Hawkman for the DC group and some one-shots for them. And I wasn't very happy with them for the reason I told you, that whatever it was, whether you wanted to call it ego, possibly, I don't think it was. I didn't like the lack of individuality in the sense I was not allowed to sign anything. And this bothered me. It connected even to my falling out, when I say falling out, coming out in the morning at 5 a.m. at Fort Dix in a khaki olive green mechanic's outfit with 500 other soldiers, and you were just one of hundreds. And so I think I always had that feeling of not wanting to be different or noticed, but wanted to be having a sense of self. And I couldn't get that with DC, there's no question. Because I liked doing Hawkman. It was a strip that appealed to me a lot. And so I went to I did a lot of one-shots for True Magazine and for other places. And then I locked on to Avon. They interested me a lot because they had a paperback line as well, and I was shooting for the big magazines. I never looked down on anything I did, and I think I am a product of the comics. Really, like my friend Tony Bennett, who I was in high school with, he came out of the big band era. Never forgot it. Never forgot where he came from. I was a narrative artist. I loved telling stories. And so I was doing pulps, $15 a drawing, or no, not even, $8 a drawing. And I was being published by Better Publications, which had a line of pulps. They were the biggest, I would say, competitor in the pulp magazines. At the same time I was doing comics, and I found with Avon, I met, the editor then was a man named Saul Cohen. I'm talking now about probably getting close to 1950. And Saul Cohen took a shine to me. And whatever it was, he either liked my personality, my work, whatever, and he gave me total freedom. And that, I can't tell you what that meant to me. Because I'd get a script, and I was able to move the panels around as I wanted to. In other words, let's say it was laid out for 6 panels, and I felt if I combined panels 2 and 3 and broke into the squares or the boxes, I was able to do things more creatively. It was an instinct, not a desire to be different, just it was a creative feeling. And then they had the pages, I remember when you opened the inside front cover, where they wanted, instead of a table of contents, I don't know if, I may have had something to do with that, saying why not have some drawings instead of a listing there of what's in the magazine. And I would get the 4 stories that were going to be in that issue, or 5, but generally 4. Or I would take 4, and I would come up with, I had no guidelines at all or restrictions. I would just say, they would say to me, Ray, we're doing Erie Comics, or we're doing such and such. Here are the stories that are going in there. I'd look through them, and I'd take things that I thought would illustrate them. And I never once, I maybe, I don't know what I say, maybe at least 100 of them. I never once had Saul, so take this out or put this in, or change this. And of course, that's all most of us were all used to, were corrections. It was the bête noire of all our, you bring something in and say, oh, can you change that, or move over that figure, or white that out. I never had any corrections with those. I had total freedom. And so when I remember doing some of the Eries, there was a German illustrator who was, I think, a goddamn genius in pen and ink, brilliant, named Clay, K-L-E-Y, Heinrich Clay. He was out of the, I believe his work was banned by Hitler because it was very satiric and very critical. He had a most delicious line. I don't think there was a better pen and ink artist ever. I know that James Montgomery Flagg, who was probably after Gibson, the greatest pen and ink artist this country ever produced, adored Clay. He was an artist's artist. So I used to use influenced a lot by Clay, and of course Alex Raymond, who did Flash Gordon, was probably the great hero to all of us. And to this day, I don't think there was anyone with his brilliance. I understood that, what was his name, Ladd, who did, was it Star Wars? Lucas. No, it was Ladd, the son of Alan Ladd, the actor. And he said that the Star Wars were inspired by Flash Gordon, or the science fiction. Wonderful pen and ink. No, excuse me, brush and ink. At any rate, so I was doing those for Avon, and the publisher was a man named Joseph Myers. And I think, it seems to me they were somewhere in Midtown Manhattan, and then the business really took off. Joe kind of latched on to where paperback, I think it was called Pocketbooks, the official name. Pocketbooks were, I think, part of Simon & Schuster. Yes.